Howdy, folks. It's your old pal David Cobb here, coming at you on Democracy in Action as part of the Green News Network. You know, Gil Scott-Heron famously said the revolution will not be televised, but it will be brought to you over non-corporately filtered news, information, and analysis sources like the Green News Network. It is my honor tonight to be interviewing Reg Flowers. He is an artist. He is an educator. He is a social change agent. He is also the lead organizer for the Pedagogy in Theater of the Oppressed. We've got lots to talk about, so let's jump right into it. Reg Flowers, welcome to Democracy in Action.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, David. It's great to be here.
It's nice to see you again. And, you know, before we get into the Pedagogy in Theater of the Oppressed, and before we get into the conference and to tease folks, Detroit, Michigan coming up in June. But before we get into that, Reg, I always like to give our guests an opportunity to share a little bit about yourself. In other words, I know you. You're smart. You're articulate. You work hard. You could be making a lot of money doing other things. So I'm curious to know, why do you do what you do? What are you doing? What is in your background or childhood sort of brought you to the path that we're having this conversation now?
Oh, it's a great question. Thank you, David, for asking. What's interesting is I really, grew up assuming that I was going to be, a movie star. I was going to be, in the theater, and really started developing as a theater artist. I wrote my first play when I was in the third grade. And so this was something that was in my blood, and got a degree from a master's degree from Yale, and had been working, had done some television, had done some theater, and fell into a volunteer opportunity working with young people on the west side of Manhattan, in a pretty challenged neighborhood. And that was kind of the beginning of the end of my career as a theater artist per se, and the beginning of my career in social justice. I found myself giving up paid gigs to go and volunteer with these young people, and ultimately ended up taking a job with the organization that I was volunteering with. And there were all kinds of contradictions for me in that work. I was generally working with young people who would be considered underprivileged. I was working with them with people who were celebrities, people who were, fairly well off. And what I had, there was a moment in doing that work when I realized that the reality that these young people are living makes possible the reality that the people who are stepping in to aid them are living.
Hint, it's called capitalism. Please continue.
It's called capitalism, absolutely. And it didn't help that someone introduced me to Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So I read Paulo Freire, and so here I am working with young people in a fairly the program was around education and using arts as a form of education for young people, but at the same time, we were presenting a model of what things were supposed to be for these young people and kind of spoon feeding them. And then suddenly I'm reading this book and being exposed to a completely different approach to education and education for liberation, which was not something that ever came up in conversations that we were having in that organization. And later, I was introduced to Theater of the Oppressed through an organization in New York City, and that was it. Not only was I aware of contradictions between the way that I was, we were working with these young people and the world that the ideas that we were presenting to these young people, and keeping them completely separate from this other world of privilege that they likely weren't going to get to be a part of. I was also becoming aware of the role of oppression in my own life. And so at that point, it just became clear that I needed to be working in a very, very different way. I left that organization, started my own organization, and, really haven't turned back since then.
Reg, there's so much in what you just said. I want to unpack just a little of it.
Mhm.
First, for viewers who may not be familiar with the concept of popular education or education for liberation, could you share with us what that means and why that's so important?
Sure. I mean, basically, it first of all moves away from this idea that the student is this empty vessel, walking into the space with no information, no experience, and that they are this receptacle for the information that we want them to have. And so we deposit that information, and when we're ready, we'll get that. We'll withdraw that information in the way of a test, or when we're asking them questions. But their experience doesn't play a role at all. And so popular education says that, first of all, that the education is not neutral. It has as its goal the transformation of society. It is participant driven. It poses problems. Those are just some of the aspects of popular education. And if you Google popular education, you'll get different versions of those same components, but for the most part, that's what you're looking for. And and I think the primary part is that what we're trying to do is mine the knowledge of the individual to discover those things that will be necessary in order to live and to thrive.
One of the things that I find particularly inspiring and for me incredibly fulfilling about a popular education technique is that everybody is a student, everybody is a teacher. When you come into a space where there are skilled popular educators, whether they are a student or the teacher, you end up in this very beautiful sort of symbiotic dance where you are watching and participating in culture actually happening, right? I mean, culture is not merely a medium, it is everything that we do. And frankly, it's a bit like a well-facilitated meeting. Once you've attended a really well-facilitated consensus-seeking meeting, it's hard to go to a typical hierarchical somebody at the front telling you, right? And for me, it's the same thing. Now that I've had the experience of being in well-facilitated popular education spaces, I'm a terrible passive listener now. I can't do it because there's none of the lively, vibrant sort of sparkle and magic that happens in a popular education technique. Surely I'm not the only one who has this experience.
I would say that you're not the only one who has that experience. I mean, I often refer to myself as a co-learning facilitator. I don't even really use the word teacher, but definitely as you were talking about that, you reminded me here in Brooklyn a few years back, we had a hurricane that pretty much destroyed the infrastructure in communities all around the coast of Brooklyn and New Jersey, and Hurricane Sandy. And I remember being asked to facilitate meetings with people from the National Guard and the mayor's office and the police department and the New York City Housing Authority and people from the community, and sitting in a circle with that group of people, and how alien it must have felt for people who just considered people who usually sit at the front of the room, right, and talk. And there's a little time for questions maybe, but to sit in a circle and go around and have everyone have an opportunity to speak is so empowering. And as the facilitator, I think it's easier. It makes my work, because then everybody in the room is sharing in the responsibility for what happens in the room.
Reg, as you were sharing that anecdote, it made me chuckle because I remember actually one of the things that I often say to folks who have not had that experience, when you get in a room of Green Party members, to have a meeting, you can tell they're greens because the first thing they do is tear the room apart and make a circle out of it, right? I mean, it is literally part of our DNA as Green Party members, activists, organizers, is that we actually get in circles together with one another. There's something, frankly, very magic about the circle, and if it's especially small enough to be able so that everybody can actually see each other, and the process is something very important. And as a Green Party member, one of the things that I wanted to really lift up and ask you to reflect on is the recognition that art and culture is not merely something to be passively consumed and appreciated or enjoyed. Surely there is, plenty of room for just pure enjoyment of art, theater, music, poetry, etc. But as a social change agent and a straight up revolutionary myself, I mean, I am interested in the idea and the recognition that no successful social change has ever happened that did not manifest and express itself artistically through music and poetry and theater and so forth. Am I overstating the case, or do you think that's true?
I would say I'm inclined to agree. I say I'm inclined to agree because I don't want to feel like an egomaniac as a cultural organizer. I don't want to inflate my own sense of importance, but I do agree with you. And one of the people that I admire greatly is the late Grace Lee Boggs, and reading Revolution and Evolution in the 21st Century, which she wrote with her late husband James Boggs. There are chapters and chapters that talk about social movements from the past that have failed because they have failed to engage people around culture, around the things that they touch in their daily lives and that they come in contact with in their daily lives. And so yes, I've embraced that understanding and do it resonates very deeply with me.
And I'll just say it, I'm not an artist. I'm not a culture worker. I mean, I'm a decent storyteller, but I'm not an artist at all in the traditional sense. So to me, the things that you and Ruthie and other practitioners do is a type of magic to me. And I don't mean sleight of hand, I mean, it's wizardry, right? And what I know is I desperately need it, right? In order to be a successful revolutionary, I've got to partner and pair myself with people like you who can actually do that. And again, whether it's hip hop music or, frankly, I would argue country and Western music at its best was actually liberatory, right? And you mentioned hip hop before we got on, and so I want to share with you, I was doing a series of workshops with a colleague, Shamako Noble of Hip Hop Congress, called "What the Bleep Happened to Hip Hop?" And of course, the short answer is the corporate commodification of what began as a liberatory art form is what happens to hip hop. But having said that, rural redneck 54-year-old white dude, has a hip hop joke for you. Are you ready?
Come on.
All right. It goes like this. What did they used to call conscious hip hop?
I don't know. What did they used to call conscious? What did they used to call?
Right?
All right.
Think about it. How did it go from don't push me because I'm close to the edge, trying hard not to lose my head? It's like a jungle sometime, right? How did it go from that to lick it like a lollipop? Did that just happen? Or was it the lyric committees and the creation of the bling bling and the sort of misogynistic language and so forth? That didn't just happen, right? I mean, and so all hip hop music at one time was mostly liberatory, right? And the reality is there's now a subgenre of it, right? It's a very interesting phenomenon. And this is really a perfect time. You talked about Grace Lee Boggs, of course, who spent many years in her last years in Detroit, Michigan. We know that Detroit is going to be hosting a conference called Pedagogy in Theater of the Oppressed. So I want to give you an opportunity, Michael O'Neill, our technical producer, if you would throw that up on the screen and give you a chance to talk a little bit about the Pedagogy in Theater of the Oppressed.
Okay. Well, this conference is something that I've actually been hearing about from Julian Boal, whose father is Augusto Boal, who is the founder of the Theater of the Oppressed. And it's a conference that's held every year. I think this might be the 22nd conference. And I'd actually been trying to convince him that Detroit was the perfect space for this conference to take place because of the fact that Detroit is so under siege right now. And there's such a strong movement force happening in Detroit, and you've been there, and you can talk about that as well. I've been in Detroit for the past 4 years, working very closely with artists and organizers and educators from all over the city. And so the fact that this conference is going to bring together people who are doing similar work from all over the country, all over the world, to just talk about the current challenges and talk about the ways that people are shifting minds through popular education and popular theater. The theme of the conference this year is I'm so sorry, I'm having it's from waging love. It's breaking the silence, from rebellion to waging love, and breaking the silence is in homage to Martin Luther King, and it's the 50th anniversary of his speech Beyond Vietnam. And so,
and I want to stop you for a moment. To our viewers, King has been sanitized, and the I Have a Dream speech and others are the ones that get played and lifted up all the time. But for my money, the Beyond War or Beyond Vietnam, where he talks about the triple evils of capitalism, well, he calls it materialism, militarism, and racism. Like that's King at the essence of waging fierce, loving revolution. So I really want to encourage folks to check out that speech if you're not familiar with it. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I just really wanted to lift that up.
No, absolutely. And I think that is something that, it's so interesting because I also, I'm a vlogger, and I spend most of my time trying to bring my, cultural ideas to the internet, and end up in discussions. Often I'm having Martin Luther King thrown up in my face as, someone who, was, embracing nonviolence, and, this message of King as, spreading love and, Black people and white people together. But Martin Luther King was also very critical of white people, of moderate white people.
Letter from a Birmingham jail.
Letter from a Birmingham jail. Absolutely. And people should read that. And so people who might think of Martin Luther King as basically like this glue, he's the glue between, Black culture and white culture. But Martin Luther King, was engaged in a struggle, and he was using, nonviolence as, a tactic. But he also understood that we were engaged in a struggle where the tactic that was being used against African Americans was one of violence.
Right.
Was one of violence.
And it was legalized violence. It was unethical. It was immoral, but the law had legalized it. And so, his exhortation that it was not only a right but a responsibility to violate unjust laws, that one did not willy-nilly put one's body on the line, but actually go through a process by which you give the system every opportunity to make right, to do justice. I just think that King, the theoretician, King, the strategist, is not studied or talked about often enough. I mean, his soaring rhetoric is so beautiful and profound that we sort of get caught up in that. But we forget, what he did at the time was really revolutionary. And We forget that the FBI and the ruling elite considered him a public enemy. We forget that the liberal intelligentsia of the day, the white liberal class, actually hated him and was constantly encouraging him to slow down. And I also want to point out, to get us back to the Pedagogy in Theater of the Oppressed, Martin Luther King Jr. was absolutely committed to using music, poetry, and art in that movement.
It's interesting because the Vincent Harding, who wrote the speech breaking the silence beyond Vietnam, I had the honor of meeting him the year before he passed away at a celebration in Detroit. And he stood up and said, well, back in my day, we used to sing. And he had this room full of people break into, this little light of mine. And at the time, I was thinking to myself, who's this guy? And then to, find out that he was, the person who had penned this speech that we're now going to be celebrating was kind of amazing, and a reminder that there was a time when people did understand that bringing aspects of culture into our struggles was important. It's just important to the life and health of the struggle itself.
It's how we talk to each other, in a deep way. And I'll confess, Reg, I got you off of talking about the conference because you enticed me with Beyond Vietnam, which is my favorite bit of political writing. But I want to come back to, and I think Michael O'Neill is going to throw the card up about the conference, because I do want viewers of the Green News Network and of Democracy in Action I want to invite you to this conference. I'll be there. Reg will be there. Lots of Detroit Greens will be there. Reg, tell us what we're looking at on this card that Michael has put up, and what can people expect at this conference?
Well, the conference, again, is going to be a gathering of popular educators from around the world and theater of the oppressed practitioners from around the world. There'll be a it'll all be happening in Detroit in June. There's a pre-conference from May 30th through June 1st with Julian Bawal, again, whose father is the founder of the Theater of the Oppressed. And the formal conference itself will be held from June. Actually, it will kick off the evening of June 1st through Sunday, June 4th. That's 2017. And it'll be held at Cass Corridor Commons, which is at 4605 Cass Avenue in Detroit. And I'm really thrilled because I've been coming to conferences basically for the past 4 years. I've probably been to 8 conferences in Detroit. And over those years, I've gone from being a conference attendee to being the lead organizer for a conference, but always working with many of the same folks. They're kind of like this reserve of amazing conference organizers who've been doing this for years and years in Detroit. And each year, there's like one conference that becomes the conference of, the conference of the season. And so many Detroit folks have come together to lend their support to organizing this one, including Tawana Petty, who goes by Honeycomb the Poet, who has in many ways been the engine of many of the conferences that I've been attending, including the Social Solidarity Economy Forum, which I think you were at last April.
That's right. We met them.
Yeah, and so Tawana has been an amazing, amazing support in making this happen. And each year we've been doing this, and things like Pedagogy of the Oppressed and her poetry workshop have always been this thing on the side. And so to finally have a conference that is bringing culture to the center is really amazing. And I feel like it's the perfect time for it as well in our current political climate.
And I really want to lift up for folks as well that, number one, if you are in Detroit, there is a special category to be able to attend. Number two, there is a special dispensation for poor people and students to be able to come. And then the third thing that I really want to underscore is, and I'm just going to name it, Detroit is a laboratory. Because if you want to see what late stage capitalism looks like, Detroit and Flint and Benton Harbor, this is what it looks like. The emergency financial managers, what I call the emergency fascist managers, where you're literally ceding the authority to govern to corporate masters that are actually appointed, that are allowed to make governing decisions. This is where we're headed. So, it's also worth pointing out, and again, I'm going to name it: Detroit, Benton Harbor, Flint. These are majority people of color, majority black communities. They are the canaries in the coal mine. And what you're seeing in Detroit especially is the wholesale stripping and selling, or an attempted sell-off, of the public commons, right, to privatize it. And not just the goods and services, but literally an effort to privatize decision-making authority and governance itself. This is the precursor to fascism, folks. Yeah, so, I go to Detroit any chance I get, because I think that we have to learn both what the enemy is doing, but also look at the amazing resilience for the fight back that people like us are engaged in.
And David, even just just in terms of Michigan, in terms of the natural resources, we have a state that is touched on, all sides by 4 of the Great Lakes. That represents 20% of the world's fresh water, drinking water, and that's not something to be taken lightly. And when we're talking about the privatization of natural resources, like the water, I think that's when we all need to be concerned. And, it's no accident that the same folks who are responsible for what happened in Flint are the same people who are consulting on the privatization of water, public transportation, waste removal, and education as well. And, these are folks that don't have a great reputation. These are folks, I think you may be familiar with the dumping of tens of millions of gallons of wastewater into the San Francisco Bay because of the same shenanigans with the same company.
This is what happens when you corporatize. I don't even like to say privatize. When you corporatize public sector, right? This is what neoliberalism means, by the way. And neoliberalism is the precursor for and sets up neo-fascism. Part of the reason I'm a Green Party member is because I don't want either neoliberalism or neo-fascism. I actually want actual democracy. And whether you call it democracy, autonomy, self-determination, however you talk about it, really what we're talking about is the idea, radical as it is, that we, the people, are actually supposed to be allowed to govern ourselves, that we actually get to create the society in which we live. And the neoliberal agenda, represented by Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Committee, are actually not believers in real, genuine democracy. And I think that needs to be said out loud.
And thank you for saying it. Yeah, and it's so clear, if nothing else, to come to Detroit to see how it fails us ultimately, how it fails us, and then who gets blamed when it does. Yes, absolutely. Right.
Capitalism. And so, as I feared, Reg, the 30 minutes have just flown by. So it's been a very rich conversation. I do want to encourage folks. I'm going to go to Detroit June 1st through 4th is when I'll be there. And I know lots of other folks are going to be there. Julia Boal, the son of Augusto Boal. And of course, if you have heard about the Pedagogy of the Oppressed and the work of Paulo Freire, the Pedagogy and Theater of the Oppressed conference is a literal merger of these two concepts. Reg Flowers, I'm going to give you an opportunity for some final thoughts before we sign off.
I would just say, come to the conference. It's going to be bringing together some of really the greatest practitioners of this work from, again, around the world into one space for 3 amazing days of working and strategizing and sharing and celebration, I hope, too.
Wonderful. So, folks, you've been watching Democracy in Action. I'm your host, David Cobb. We've been speaking with Reg Flowers, artist, educator, and lead organizer of the Pedagogy and Theater of the Oppressed. Hope to see you there. And as I do every week, I want to close out with a deep appreciation and gratitude and thanks to the amazing team of the Green News Network who does not only this show, but a Jamu Baraka show and Jill Stein show. I'm talking about Melissa Figueroa, the executive producer, Jillian Thomas, who is the goddess of social media, and Michael O'Neill, technical producer par excellence. Thanks to those three people, and thanks to you, the listener. In the meantime, we're out. Peace.